Hello, and welcome to Veronica's Voice, the podcast for cycle breakers and legacy makers, where we keep it real, raw, and authentic. So, in today's episode, we're going to be talking about secondary abuse, secondary trauma after you have experienced an abusive relationship, and specifically how that impacts you as a parent. And not only are we going to be addressing what secondary trauma is and unexpected places where you may experience it, we're also going to be giving you tools to actually utilize these resources in a way that's to your benefit. Because what we're going to talk about is how some of these resources you may be reaching out to are actually detrimental to your parenting if you are parenting with a narcissistic ex. Y'all probably know I'm Veronica Archer. I'm a narcissistic trauma recovery coach. Some of you may know that I am also a mom to 3 young adult boys who are now 23, 19, and 18. And so we're going to be drawing on this experience of parenting with a narcissistic ex. And I'm super excited to be joined today by AJ Gajar. She is also a mom to a young girl. So you're going to get 2 different perspectives here in terms of parenting. And she is also a child development specialist. So really quick, before we dive into the meat of this, we're going to give just like a 2-second version of our past so you kind of know where we're coming from if you happen to be new. And then we're going to dive right into secondary trauma and how it is negatively impacting your parenting. So AJ, go ahead and share with our people what you know about narcissism, why this topic is important to you.
Yeah, I was married to somebody for about 8 years, didn't realize at the time that he was narcissistic and disordered. And all that came out kind of afterwards. And then just experiencing the impacts, like the post-separation impacts for myself, and then seeing the impacts it was having on my daughter, who was 5 at the time. That's what kind of really got me thinking and diving into a lot of this, secondary trauma piece, the impacts of having a narcissistic parent on children, what we can do as the healthy parent to support that, and things like that.
Awesome. Thank you. And then, of course, as I mentioned, you are also a child development specialist. So you bring that, you combine that with your personal lived experience of being married to a narcissist and bring that together to talk about parenting with a narcissistic ex. And so for those of you that don't know, I was married for 16 years, didn't realize my ex was a narcissist until after I left. Been out of that for a while now, and almost 10 years of experience dealing with the parenting piece and the post-divorce parenting piece. So let's dive into secondary trauma and what is secondary trauma. So we'll just sort of chat about this for a little bit, but AJ, go ahead and share with people who may not know secondary trauma or secondary abuse. By the way, really quick for our listeners, I tend to interchange the words abuse and trauma. That is intentional. And that is because so many people that have experienced narcissistic trauma or emotional manipulation don't recognize it as abuse. And oftentimes people won't seek out resources for support because they're like, I wasn't abused. That's for people who are abused. But what we're experiencing when we go through emotional manipulation, when we experience emotional manipulation, our bodies experience that as trauma, our systems experience that as trauma. So you'll hear me talk about narcissistic trauma and interchange that with abuse. So I just wanted to clarify that really quick. So secondary abuse or secondary trauma, AJ?
So yeah, coming out of the relationship that I was in, I mean, as a lot of this audience probably is aware, not like the primary abusive relationship wasn't bad enough. Now you also have to start recognizing and expecting places of secondary trauma. So I would say my definition of secondary trauma is any trauma or abuse that happens kind of after you've left that primary relationship. And it's not necessarily from that individual, but it's from people around you, right? So it can be from places that you don't even think of. It can be from very well-intentioned friends and family. In the form of, either kind of undermining your situation or in a bid to kind of help you feel better. A lot of what I heard at the time was, are you sure it was that bad? Like, it wasn't that bad, right?
Right.
Like,
invalidating comments. It's not that
right?
bad.
Yeah, absolutely.
Can't you just communicate with the kids? In my case, the kid's dad, with the other parents. So it's things that are invalidating your own experience, telling you that basically it's almost a form of gaslighting, because it's telling you that what you're experiencing isn't real. And when you hear that over and over again, or when you hear that from places of authority, your system experiences that as a micro trauma, which then compounds onto the trauma you've already experienced, and it contributes to complex PTSD and compounded trauma. Awesome.
Yeah, and it's like you said, Veronica, right? Like it's not like the primary abuse situation wasn't bad enough, but then to have to experience this, like comments and stuff like this from other people who you may feel super safe with. And you think when you share your story with them, they're really going to come beside you and be like, oh, I can't even imagine. And yes, of course you feel this way. And, you think they're going to validate your experience. But I think the challenge is when you start hearing things that don't actually validate your experience, you actually go through the cycle of doubting it all over again yourself. And that really, I know for me, I know for a lot of other people I've spoken to, that really holds you back in your healing and for moving forward, because you're constantly questioning and second guessing everything, right?
Absolutely. And it can contribute to you doing things that are actually contrary to your healing. So if someone's like a well-intentioned friend or family member is like, oh, they're not really that bad, I think if you just communicate more with your ex or with the kid's parent, then you can co-parent and you can work together to support your kids, put the kids first. And then you try to do that and it freaking blows up in your face because the other parent is being abusive, emotionally manipulative, controlling, all those things. And no amount of being nice and respectful and polite and amicable is going to work. And so then you're stuck in this place of like, my friend or my whomever is telling me to reach out to the other parent. When I do, it blows up in my face. Now what am I supposed to do?
Yeah. So what am I doing wrong? And that's kind of where I got stuck, is what am I doing wrong? Because everybody's telling me that this should work and it's not working.
It's not working.
So then, right, what am I doing wrong? And I think it's really important to recognize too, all these well-intentioned people we try and gain support from, I don't think they invalidate and undermine our experience intentionally. I think the one thing to really realize is, unless you've been in a narcissistically abusive relationship, nobody outside of that realm is ever going to understand it. 100%. Right?
Because it doesn't make sense. They do
doesn't
things
make
that
sense.
Don't make sense. And even now I have friends who watched me go through, the recovery process I've been through, but they don't have any experience with narcissism themselves. And they still ask, like, if I share something that my boy's dad has done, they're like, why did he do that? That doesn't make any sense. No, it doesn't. It doesn't make any sense. And there's no trying to explain it because it doesn't make any sense. But if you're earlier, so that's where I am now, but if you're earlier on in your healing, you may be like, wait, what's wrong? As you just said, AJ, it can really keep you stuck there. So we've already given some examples, like well-intentioned friends, family members, things like that. What are some places that might be more unexpected that somebody may experience secondary trauma where they're not looking for it or aware of it, prepared for it?
So I think you made a really good point in terms of just recognizing that this is really, I'm hoping this is super helpful for people who are really early on in their journey, because they're not going to expect it. Like, you will be reaching out to anybody you can reach out to for help and support, right? And especially professionals. When you're looking at lawyers, you might be looking for therapists for your children. For school yourself. And life continues for your kids. So you're looking at your parent-teacher interviews and you're talking to the teachers, coaches, your children's friends, parents. Sometimes they won't understand it either. So I think it's really important to kind of be really open-minded and almost expect it in any situation you go into. The one thing I remember being really hard for me is I was always putting my faith into all these professionals, right? Like, I was stuck in this really not great situation for me and my daughter. And I would go to a therapist and be like, this is what's happening. I need you to help her. And their response really to me would be, well, maybe you should really try some co-parenting classes and see if the two of you can communicate better, because I don't know if I really want to get in the middle of this, or, we can't begin therapy for your daughter without consent from both parents. So then that led me
on the co-parenting. I just want to point out really quick and highlight that for people listening, because you need to learn how to co-parent, or you should be co-parenting. is something that comes up over and over, and it comes up in different places, especially in the legal system. So it'll come up from a therapist for sure. Lawyers and judges in particular, at least where I went through my divorce, they will always present co-parenting as the solution to whatever you're struggling with. I remember having a judge bring it up way down the road. Several years down the road, we'd gone back to court for something, and I can't even remember the details now, but I do remember the judge saying, "Oh, I think you guys should go to co-parenting." And of course, at that point, I already know, I just feel this, constriction in my system, because I know co-parenting doesn't work. By the way, if you're not yet aware that co-parenting doesn't work, AJ and I are doing a masterclass, a free masterclass later this month. So check that out, and you can hear us go more into that. But when you're earlier on in the process, and so many people are telling you to authorities, professionals are telling you to co-parent, and you're thinking that that's what you're supposed to do. And then that's part of that secondary trauma, because it doesn't work, and you'll try to do it potentially if you listen to them, and then it doesn't work.
Well, and not only does it not work, but more often than not, it makes your situation worse.
Right? It absolutely makes your situation, it can make your situation worse. And
it escalates things.
Yeah. So some other examples for if someone's earlier on, they may be dealing with lawyers. If you're dealing with a divorce, I know not everyone's going through the divorce process necessarily, but if you are, I think advice that you see a lot in the narcissistic abuse recovery community is find a lawyer who really understands narcissism, and make sure your legal agreement is solid. That's really good advice. However, lawyers, even ones that we think are highly qualified, oftentimes are not helpful. And AJ, you had an example. I was wondering if you could share where you experienced. I experienced that too, and I know others have, but I love that example that you shared.
Yeah, I specifically sought out a child advocacy lawyer. And I thought, like, this will be the best thing for my kid, because she's going to advocate for the kid, right? It's not about the parents at this point. It's about best interest of the child. And it was funny, because I sat down with her, and one of the first questions she asked me was, what does transition look like? So drop-offs and pickups. And my response, because at that point in time, our co-parenting relationship had already gotten to the point where we couldn't communicate with each other. We weren't functional in speaking to one another. So transitions were curbside. And that's what I said. I said, transitions are curbside.
And can you just explain for people if they're not familiar with that term, what curbside transitions look like?
Yeah. So that's basically drop off on the driveway. I go out of my house and grab her from the driveway, and then, the dad drives away. Same thing when it's drop off at his house. I either stay in the car, or I come around my vehicle. I give her a hug on his driveway, and then he takes her inside. Like, we do not enter each other's homes. We don't speak to one another. I
actually had an even extra layer of removal. We transitioned at the school, even when school wasn't in session. So we would both drive to the school and meet there. So they never even came to my house.
Yeah. That's a great strategy. But that's what I told the lawyer. I said, it's curbside. And instead of asking me kind of details around that and wanting me to explain, her initial response was, well, that's not going to be looked upon favorably by a judge, and you're going to want to reconsider that. And at that point, I was like, I had all my eggs in one basket with this one lawyer. Like, I had my hopes so high when I went to go see her. And why is nobody understanding why there's a need for this level of structure as far as transition goes? Like,
structure and separation, right? Separation between you and him. Yeah.
Like, why are people not understanding this? And, it got to a point where I stopped explaining it. But really, it was for the best interest of my daughter, because I would rather her see us not speaking than to always see us either in a fight, or, we all know how the narcissistic parent can sometimes be. And if every time they open their mouth, something negative is going to come out, or something bad is going to come out, and they're always pointing fingers and you're always the bad parent, that's not something that I want my daughter to, see or hear.
Exactly. And it's an effective strategy, and one that is encouraged in high conflict divorces. And yet here you have this lawyer who's a child advocacy lawyer who's telling you that if you do this, you're going to be looked unfavorably upon by the judge. And I think that's another thing that we really struggle with going through the system, whether it's the school or the legal system or therapy, is this feeling of like, I have to do it a certain way or I'm going to look bad. And if I look bad, maybe, you know, X, Y, and Z, like my ex might take my kids away from me because he can prove, or they can prove, he or she, the mom or dad, that I'm doing things wrong. Right. And so that's part of that secondary trauma. So now you're part of trauma is stimulating the nervous system that's in fight or flight mode. And so this is to kind of loop back as to why is this secondary trauma? Yeah, it sucks. People are like, it sucks. Yeah, it sucks. And also your body is like, oh, fear. I'm doing something wrong. A person in authority, a judge or a teacher or a therapist is going to think badly of me. I might lose my kids, or whatever the story is that goes in your head. Now your body is literally in that elevated, in that stressed mode. And that's what continued trauma does. It keeps you in that elevated sympathetic nervous system response state, and it causes literally trauma and stress in your body. So that's why we're talking about this as secondary trauma. So lawyers, we just gave a great example of a lawyer. Friends, we already mentioned. Some other unexpected places. Are there other places that you were surprised that you experienced this kind of secondary trauma?
Yeah, we had parent-teacher interviews at my daughter's school. It was during COVID, so it was all virtual and online. So we were, you know, waiting online for the teacher to start. And she asked me, she's like, is her dad going to be joining us? And I, quite frankly, just looked at her and I said, I don't know. And she said, oh, has he booked another time to meet with me? And I said, I'm sorry, I don't know. So like the look on her face that I saw at the time was just like, she kind of furrowed her eyebrows, and then she just kind of shook her head, and like you could see the displeasure that she was experiencing. Like, why can these parents, for the sake of their daughter, not communicate and not get their stuff together? Like, why can you not, for the sake of the kids? And so at that point, I pretty much interrupted whatever thoughts she might have been having. And I said, we should just start. Like, whether he joins us later on or whether he connects with you later, that's going to be on him. But for now, we should just start. Like, I know you have your whole evening booked. So, you know, let's just take the time that we have and move forward. Right. And I think the thing to recognize for a lot of people who are early on in their journey is that we're so traumatized coming out of these relationships. We are ourselves in survival mode. We are looking in it. I think it's a normal response, right? We are looking for validation any place you could possibly find it. So when I talk to a doctor and be like, you know, can you provide me with a letter that says, you know, therapy would benefit my daughter because I was having a really hard time getting him to consent to therapy. And her response to me was, there's co-parenting classes down the street in that building over there. You two would really benefit from taking those.
There it is again, right? So you go to a doctor for help. So the narcissistic ex is not providing consent for your child, your daughter, to go to therapy, which you feel she needs. And you're legally required to get consent from both parents. So you're like, okay, let me go to an authority person, because the narcissist often will listen to authority, or at least there's a third party involved. And you go to the doctor, and the doctor's response is, you need co-parenting. Basically, you're doing something wrong. You're doing it wrong, AJ. You need to go to co-parenting and figure it out. And that'll solve everything. And you're like, I can go to co-parenting, but it's not going to resolve this.
No. And it's not going to work well. No.
Yeah. And it won't work well. So now you're experiencing that as a trauma in your body. Not everyone, but most likely, especially if you're early on in your healing process, you're going to receive that as a trauma, as a secondary trauma. The reason I said not everybody is because as you go through your healing and you learn how to process these kinds of situations, you can actually, trauma is something, is our response to an event rather than the event itself. So the act of the doctor saying you need to go to co-parenting in and of itself isn't necessarily a trauma, but as I mentioned earlier, it's the way our systems respond to it. I go into fear, I go into guilt, I go into all panic, all these things, stress responses. So you can get to a point, as AJ and I have, where these things just they don't even enter our system. So we don't experience it as a trauma. So you can absolutely get to a place where you can learn how to navigate this, so it's not a trauma. Most people, especially if you're earlier on, even not super early, but earlier on in learning how to co-parent with a narcissist, you may be experiencing these, your system may be experiencing these as a trauma. a micro trauma. Cool. So we're going to all these experts and resources out there because you're trying to support your kid after after a divorce. And AJ, I know you and I have discovered or experienced, or just know from our professional experience, that any child needs support after a divorce. But when you're dealing with a parent who's a narcissist, these kids likely need more support, probably need therapy, or I'll let you speak to some of the things that the kids need.
Yeah. So for one, if you have children in this situation, I would say if you can get them into therapy as soon as possible, that would be the best thing to do. The thing about therapy, though, it's also tricky, right? Because not only can it also be a source of secondary trauma for yourself, and I would like to clarify also, right? Like when you're receiving these, when you're receiving secondary trauma from these professionals, it's also not intentional on their part, right? Like there is such a level of unawareness and a level of uneducation within the community and within, I would say, all these sectors, really, that nobody's really aware of personality disorders. They don't know the breadth of it. They don't know the depth of it. They don't know the impacts of it. They're just not educated in it, right? And it's
Or
just
they
not that
believe,
mainstream.
Yes, I think that's 100% true. And they believe they're giving you helpful input and advice.
Yes.
And not only are they not educated and informed, but even if they are, you know, people assume that when you're going through a divorce that you're going to speak ill of the ex. And so people might be like, oh, my ex is a narcissist, when they're really not. And so I think some of these professionals, you know, kind of are taking things with a grain of a mountain of salt, not just a grain of salt. And they're assuming that you're probably not dealing with a cluster B personality disorder, and they're giving you advice accordingly.
Yeah, exactly. So even having said that, though, right, like even with therapy, if you can find a therapist that is really well informed about these things and the impacts that a narcissistic parent can have on children, that is really your best bet. And even at that point in time, I would say really just go in and not say that your co-parent or the parent of your children you believe is narcissistic or presents with narcissistic behaviors. I would leave that off the table, honestly, because I think that's something, if you're going to an expert, that is something that they're going to have to figure out for themselves. And I say that from a place of like, you go in and tell an expert, like you go in and tell a therapist, I think my ex is a narcissist. Number one, it's not going to make you look very good. Number two, they're not going to put any weight on that because you yourself are not a professional. You're not a therapist. You're not a psychiatrist. You have no ability to actually diagnose another person. And labeling another person like that is actually just not going to work in your favor, right? So I would really focus on the behaviors and be like, this is how my daughter feels. This is how my children feels. Or, you know, this is what I've observed. They don't want to go to daddy's house, or they don't want to go to mommy's house. They, you know, this is what I see from them when they return back from their visit. You know, like help me support them in that way and really shift the conversation so that it's not about what that other parent is or isn't doing, but it's really about what you can do to support the kids. And
yes, and AJ, really, I'm gonna go ahead.
No, I was just gonna say, just really be aware, because the first step of the therapist might still be, no, we got to improve the relationship with the other parent first.
Yeah, and I want to talk about that in a minute. I know you have a great example to share about that, but what you're sharing right now is so huge, and I just want to pause and highlight it, and make sure that, you know, people listening really understand that what AJ is sharing right now is such an important strategy. And I feel like for you, AJ, it's almost so natural, and you're just talking about it like, oh yeah, I just do this. But this is actually a intentional strategy and approach, right? So I want to make sure that you're really hearing that in what AJ is sharing. So we just shared how you experience secondary trauma, and how the advice that you're getting from these well-intentioned professionals can actually make things worse for you and your child if you were dealing with a narcissistic ex. So, okay, so now what? Am I just floating out in space all alone trying to juggle everything? It can feel that way sometimes, but like nobody believes you. You're trying all these different things that people, you know, authorities, experts are telling you to do, and it's not working. And you can just really feel like hopeless and alone and isolated. So there is a way, which is what AJ is sharing, to actually use these professionals, the expertise that they have, and the support that they can provide your kids and your family. However, it's important to do it in a way that's actually beneficial, which is exactly what AJ was sharing. So oftentimes when we go to these professionals, like a therapist or a teacher or a lawyer, we may be sharing what you just said, AJ, like, oh, my ex is a narcissist, or they're so terrible. And it's from a space of wanting validation from that expert. I'll let you speak to that for a minute.
Yeah, I think, like I said, right, when we're really early in our journey, we're seeking validation from any place and anywhere we can get it. Anybody who's going to give it to us, right? So if there's a ray of hope where you're going to talk to the teacher and be like, oh, this is why she's struggling and whatever. Oh yeah, he sounds like a terrible dad and he sounds like this. You're looking for that kind of validation to really validate your own experience from anywhere you can find it. And you'll take it from anywhere you can find it, right? But I think the key to that also is really self-reflection and looking at, why is it that you really need this validation? Because if you're going out there looking for validation, that's parts of yourself that haven't been healed if you're still seeking it externally. And in trying to continually seeking it externally, you could be damaging your own situation and the situation that you're putting your kids into, right?
Yeah, exactly.
And that's just, it's not worth it for your kids. So, I mean, it
it
really comes back to your own self-care and really doing your own healing and your own therapy to make sure you get to a place of being kind of grounded and really confident in your own story, and just knowing that what you experienced is what you experienced. Nobody else out there has to validate that for you.
Exactly. And we do want that validation, because if you've experienced narcissistic trauma, you've dealt with gaslighting, or you've been told over and over and over again that what you know and what you believe, what you feel isn't true. And so I think, at least for myself, I know there was that like desire to get validation. I think that's it's a common human characteristic. And especially though, if you've experienced emotional manipulation, you're really wanting that validation. So when you go to these different experts and authorities, doctors, teachers, lawyers, therapists, to take a moment before you go in, set aside your need to explain your situation, get validation for it, set that aside, and focus on, what is the outcome that I want? I'm here, my kid is struggling with X, Y, and Z, or we as a family, we're trying to make a decision, schools, therapy, whatever. You're going to a parenting coordinator, trying to get consent from the other party for change of school, for example. Focus on the outcome. And then use this approach that AJ was just sharing, which is to share your observations and your experiences. And allow the professional to come to their own decision and input based on your observations. And you had such a great example of that approach and how that worked with a therapist with your daughter.
Yeah, so I got her into therapy. Like I said, I was super neutral, and I thought about it for a long time. Do I tell her what I know about her dad and all of those things? And I decided against it. And I thought, I'm not going to, because what we know about these personality types, high conflict personality types, maladaptive personality types, is they don't change over time. So no matter how well he presented in the beginning, he was going to show his true colors. It was just a matter of time. And I needed that to come out on its own, right? So the hardest part for me, and I think the hardest part in a lot of these situations, is you have to recognize that you have information that the other party doesn't have, and you have information that you believe that the other party is not going to believe, even if you share it. So you're going to sit back and you're going to have to let things play out. So one of the first approaches that my therapist had was, you know what, we really have to improve your daughter's relationship with her dad. She doesn't have an attachment to him. She's not close to him. She's not spending time with him. So we really need to work on that relationship for her to feel safe and strong in it. And I bit my tongue and I was like, oh, this is bad. This is not going to work well. And I knew to a certain degree that was putting my daughter in the midst of more harm, because I knew she was being set up to fail. She was basically being set up to fail. But
and I'll just clarify, short-term harm. You knew short-term harm. Yeah.
Yes. So she did, my daughter did all the things she was supposed to do. The therapist saw no change or very little change on dad's side. And that little change that she saw, she was super hopeful of, but it fell off in a very short period of time because it was not sustainable, right? And it took about 8 months. It was a hard 8 months, but it took about 8 months. And then the therapist called me into her office one day for a parenting session. And she said, I'm going to be completely upfront with you and honest with you. I will no longer be encouraging your daughter to better her relationship with her dad, because I am continually setting her up to fail, and I'm setting her up for more harm from him because she's not getting what she needs from him. And that's the point in time, right? And it was funny because the therapist actually said to me, he seems to present on the narcissistic scale a little bit. And I was like,
oh, that's fascinating.
Okay, can you talk to me a little more about that, right? And it's like, it's not to say that you want to undermine the therapist and undermine their expertise, but we would have never gotten to that point of her being able to support my daughter the way she needed to be supported, as far as like, kiddo, this is your situation. So now we're going to give you tools and strategies to actually manage the situation outside of let's just push for a better relationship. We would have never gotten there if I had just kept trying to push my opinion.
That's
and
right. There's so many amazing things that I think come out of that example, or that situation that you experienced. One being what you just shared is that, first of all, if you had gone in and been like, her dad, blah, 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 right? All the things. Now, potentially, I mean, who knows how it would have played out, but potentially the therapist would have been like, oh, mom's the problem. Mom is, bitter and speaking badly about dad, and wouldn't even necessarily had her attention over where it would needed to be to really support your kid. So that's one thing potentially that I see. Another thing is what you just shared, which is your kid's dad is your kid's dad and will be her dad for the rest of her life, or the rest of his life, I guess, who's ever. And the therapist is giving your daughter tools to improve her relationship with her dad. And they didn't work. And now your daughter gets to see that it didn't work. And okay, now what do we do? I mean, that whole process is learning for your kid. Also, what I think is really cool about that is that when we're dealing with a narcissistic ex, people don't believe you, first of all, typically, the secondary trauma we're talking about. And then also, it can become really difficult to make decisions, legal decisions, when you're going to court or dealing with therapists and doctors, if it's the two parents just disagreeing, and now it's your word against the other parent's word. And my experience, at least, was that never goes well, because the narcissist can present well for those. They can go to court and present well. And, so getting documentation from a third party of what is actually occurring is, in my opinion, one of the best things you can do to support your kid and your journey in parenting with a narcissistic ex. And here you just beautifully got that without having to say anything, or you didn't badmouth the other parent. And now you have a therapist documenting, I did the therapist did this with the other, in your case, the dad, it didn't work. I am no longer recommending. That's, to me, that's like huge. I am no longer recommending that your daughter try to improve her relationship with her dad. Now, imagine if down the road she wants a different, she's young now, but imagine down the road she wants a different custody arrangement. Here you have written documentation from a third party expert. Bam. And it takes patience. It takes you biting your tongue. I mean, you're a child development specialist, and you knew what was best for your daughter, but you had to sit back and bite your tongue and let the third party expert come to that conclusion. So
and I think, I was going to say, I think that's such a key thing too, is like the one point I'd really like to make is there are a multitude of different ways we can protect our kids, right? Like, to a lot of our listeners out there, like, it might sound like I threw my daughter under the bus and I didn't protect her, but there is a long-term strategy there that you have to look at, right? And I know for a lot of parents, we get very reactive, and it's, I need to protect my kid, and obtaining full custody through this particular lawyer is the only way I'm going to protect my kid. I need to protect my kid, and the therapist needs to stop pushing this relationship, and I'm going to do everything I can to push up against it. I need to protect her. And it's like you said, Veronica, right? Like it was a tough 8 months for both her and I, especially, I would say for me, because I had to bite my tongue and seeing all the things she was going through. But the learning and the experience that my daughter had, she now has like the firsthand experience of knowing, oh, like I tried all these different things and daddy didn't change. It made no difference to my relationship with my dad, right?
Exactly.
So as sad as that is, I think that's quite validating for her because she's like, oh, I tried all these different things. So it isn't me. And that's one of the things I keep repeating to her, right? Kiddo, it's not about you. It's not about you. You are not making daddy behave a certain way or not behave a certain way. This is just how daddy is, right?
Yeah.
But that, I think that experience that she went through was able to really, really solidify that for her.
Yeah, it's hugely validating for her. And then also, the point that you just made about so often parents, and I certainly went through this, were like, no, having full custody or primary custody of my kids is best for my kids. So I'm going to throw money and time and energy and resources at a lawyer who's going to help me get custody. And more than likely, I'm very sorry if you're dealing with this and you're listening to this, more than likely that approach is not going to work because of all the things that we've just shared. People don't believe you don't have the documentation. And this approach that AJ just so beautifully laid out, which requires patience, it requires a lot of self-awareness and healing on your own part to be able to hold that kind of space for the professional and for your kid to walk through that. But it is what works. So if your long-term goal is more time with my kid or less time, they need less time with a narcissistic parent because it's really damaging to them. This strategy that, as far as I know, no one talks about other than us, at least that I've heard. Probably somewhere in the world somebody does, but it's certainly not a strategy that I heard when I was navigating this process. So if you're interested in learning more about how to quote unquote co-parent, it's not co-parenting, but parenting when you're dealing with another parent who's narcissistic. AJ and I are doing a free masterclass at the end of August, and the link is available down below in the show notes for this podcast. So if you want to take this free masterclass, there'll be 3 sessions where we're going to dive into more detail about how to actually go about having these kind of positive results that AJ and I both have had with our combined 4 children, and as well as success with our own clients. And so check out that free masterclass end of August. We look forward to having you there. And before we sign off, AJ, do you have any final thoughts about, either minimizing secondary trauma or using these resources that are available in a way that's actually beneficial and not harmful?
Yes, always put the focus back on your relationship with your child.
Love it. Always put your
Always.
focus back on the relationship with your child. Beautiful. Thank you for being with me here today, AJ, and thank you for listening, and we'll see you next time. Thank you for joining me on Veronica's Voice. If you took something away from today's episode, remember to like, share, and subscribe so others can benefit as well. See you next time.